Good evening, students. Welcome to our last section of World War One, section chapter 13, section 4, a flawed peace. The essential question for this evening: how did the Allies seek to punish the Central Powers for their role in the war, and how did it backfire? Please take focus notes on what the treaty is called that ended the war, the terms of the treaty, and how might it make people feel if they were a part of the losing country. Summarize your notes by answering the essential question, including specific details. Thank you, and I look forward to discussing tomorrow. So the United States entered the war in 1917, and with a third massive industrial power, the Germans at this point in time did not really stand a chance. Although they fought hard, and if it wasn't for them partnering with the much weaker powers of the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there would be a chance that they would have won. Unfortunately for the Germans, they lost miserably. Now it was time to hammer out peace negotiations, and the lead on the peace negotiations would be led by people called the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States; Georges Clemenceau, who would be the Prime Minister of France; David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England; and Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy. The lead in negotiations would be taken on by President Woodrow Wilson. He would be the longest serving president outside of the United States borders in the history of the United States till to this day, spending nearly 6 months abroad negotiating peace. A peace that he was hoping would be lasting forever on the European continent. He outlined his peace proposal in something called the 14 Points Proposal, and this was the idea that we would create a everlasting peace on the European continent. He failed. Now, of the 14 points, the first 4 would end secret treaties, give freedom of seas, meaning no more U-boat attacks, free trade throughout the entire world, and would reduce national armies and navies. Specifically, Germany had to reduce their fighting size to 100,000 soldiers, no U-boats, no battleships, and no tanks. The 5th point would be to adjust the colonies with fairness towards the colonial people, meaning to take the power out of the European hands and give it back to the people that were in the colonies. The 6th through 13th would be changing of national borders to create new nations, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire would cease to exist, and new countries such as Austria and Hungary and the Czech Republic would be created in their place. Now, the last point would be something called the League of Nations. And the proposed idea was that it would be a general association of nations led by the United States. The idea behind this was the idea of self-determination. This meant that you would allow people to decide for themselves what type of government that they wanted to live. Basically, with Russia being destroyed in 1917 by the Communist Revolution, with Germany having to have the Kaiser abdicate or step down from the throne, you would only have one more really royal government in Europe, and that would be England, but they were already a constitutional monarchy. So the people of each country would be able to pick what type of country they wanted to live in. Now, the treaty would be negotiated in France, at probably the best place to negotiate a treaty, especially if you have to live 6 months away from your home, the Palace of Versailles. The main goal for France and Britain was very different than the United States, who wanted peace. France and Britain wanted to punish Germany severely for their crime of starting this war. They saw Germany as 100% at fault through their aggressive nationalism, and they wanted to make them pay. The Treaty of Versailles, as it would come to be known, was signed at the Paris Peace Conference on June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, which kicked off this bloody affair in Anhalt. Now, Wilson would bring up his 14th point of a League of Nations, and this was adopted, and this league was to be the international association whose goal was to keep the peace among the nations. The only problem is that the United States Senate would not ratify the League of Nations, thus the United States never joined the League of Nations, thus the League of Nations was without a head, and therefore the League of Nations, as we will see in World War II, was not effective at brokering peace on the continent. Now, how did the Allies force Germany to suffer? So first and foremost, Germany lost all of its territories overseas. That meant German East Africa. That meant its territories in Japan and the southeast. They lost all of their colonies. Secondly, both the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were broken up into multiple different countries, with parts of Germany that we would refer to as Prussia becoming Poland, the Czechoslovakia being carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria as a new country, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia, which would be carved out of the former Balkans. These would all be new nationalistic countries that would be created in the years after the war. The next big sticking point was who would pay for the war. The war cost billions of dollars, both in straight up money spent and lost revenues that were lost because of 4 years of trade essentially stopped. It was decided by the British and the French that Germany would be forced to pay reparations, meaning loser payments, to the Allies for their efforts. Germany and Germany alone would bear the brunt because their two allies, the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians, no longer existed. And so therefore, they would be the only ones left holding the bag, a debt that they would only finish paying in 2010. While Germany had no choice but to sign the treaty, this created a massive amount of resentment amongst the German people who felt that they were being severely punished for a war that essentially was more or less started by Russia and Serbia. But because Russia was no longer a country, they weren't really going to pay the war efforts. Also, for people who were victorious, the Japanese and the Italians were completely let out or left off of the spoils of war, and so therefore it also created a massive amount of resentment and bitterness in both of those countries as well, specifically directed towards the British, the French, and the United States. As I already touched on, several new countries would be created out of the war. Essentially, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottomans would basically be destroyed. And out of these countries, you would see Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire would turn into Turkey. It would also turn into Saudi Arabia and Armenia, and Russia lost a significant amount of land as well as the Bolsheviks tried to consolidate their own power in Russia. While Woodrow Wilson would be the one to create the Treaty of Versailles and to create the League of Nations, the United States Senate would go on to reject both. And for the simple reason that it has long since been held as United States policy that they would stay out of European affairs, and the League of Nations would force them to partake. And so therefore, again, because we have always been isolationists, we wanted to stay out of this. This made Woodrow Wilson look like a bit of a fool in the front of his compatriots, and this would also have very damaging effects on the future. The U.S. worked out their own treaties with the Germans and the Allies. The Treaty of Versailles was not successful at all because the U.S. rejected it. Germany was very bitter and very filled with hate, a hate that would foster for the next 30 years. The colonies who wanted independence were denied. Rather, they were just divided up amongst the British and the French, and Italy and Japan were not compensated for their efforts in the war. And surprise, surprise, there is a direct line that is drawn from World War I to World War II. And in fact, many people say that World War II is just simply the continuation of World War I, and in essence that they are essentially the same conflict. Outside of Europe, Asia and Africans also disliked how the Allies sort of just, again, went straight up Berlin Conference on them, more or less just saying, oh, we took this from Germany, France, now it's yours. We took this from Germany, England, now this is yours, basically denying their desires for independence. Italy, upset that it did not receive more land, would feel the desire to build its own empire as well under the guise of a new political ideology called fascism brought into it by a guy named Benito Mussolini. Japan, on the other hand, still looking for that respect from their European counterparts, would go full-on empire and start aggressively building a massive empire in the Pacific, but also harboring a huge amount of bitterness and resentment towards their European counterparts. Thank you very much for listening to our World War I series. If you would please summarize your notes, and below your summary, I want you to answer this question. Which of the following best describes how most of the decisions were made for the Treaty of Versailles? A. Germany came up with the most of the ideas about how France should be punished. B. Most of the decisions were made by the leaders of the main Allied countries known as the Big Four. C. The Treaty of Versailles was created as a conference by the United Nations. D. The Austro-Hungarian Empire used their military power to bully the other countries. Or lastly, again, summarize your notes and make it based on the essential question. Thank you, and I look forward to discussing with you tomorrow.